Welcome to Current Events, the first of the bi-monthly, is that what it is when you do it every 2 weeks?
Bi-weekly.
Bi-weekly, thank you. And I'm curious to know how, did any of you seriously miss me last Friday? No, don't show such, there's someone from out of town who missed me. The only person. Thinking about current events this morning, it's hard not to think that right here in Florida, as of just a few minutes ago, or maybe earlier this morning, 159 people not accounted for in the collapse of the building. It was 99 last night when I went to bed, and I guess they must be going through lists of residents and trying to contact people and say, were they traveling or were they home? But you think about that, that's just an extraordinary number. And the other one I was reminded of, and I'm reminded of frequently, is the number 600,000. If you sum World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined, we don't get to 600,000 dead. That's how many COVID killed. It's just amazing when you think about it. And that it's not over, and that there are countries in this world where it's just raging out of control. It's sad. The number of vaccines needed out there so vastly exceeds the number of vaccines available. And the cost of distribution and the means of distribution will be hard to find. Those seem to dwarf our current events topics. 5 days ago, I put together that little suggestion of what to talk about today. In the preface to that, I said something that Don Furman suggested the same thing this morning. We haven't finished critical race theory. We've talked about it twice. I thought we put it to bed. At least we all understood it. There was not much more to talk about. It is in the news on 2 or 3 cable channels every day, 5 times. It's in the newspapers every day. One of the interesting dynamics of our current news environment, local players and local papers and news outlets take their leads from the national outlets. And in cities and counties and places in this country where critical race theory has no business even existing, nobody threatened their school board or their children with anything. They read on the national news that there's an issue. They go to their parents-teacher meetings or their school board meetings and say, don't let it happen here. A little minor crisis erupts there. The national news then reports on that, and you get this feed loop that goes over and over and over again. I think that's one of the reasons we see it all the time. Anyway, we're going to talk about that very possibly in 2 weeks' time, barring something else coming up. And I also said I didn't think the story of Netanyahu's defeat is over. I think for now, but we'll see how long this coalition can hang together. It's truly a long string between the far left and the far right. It's going to be interesting to see when that string breaks. Today, though, unless there are objections, the 4 topics will be, I think, still somewhat current. The disaster in South Florida notwithstanding. Inflation, something brief on ranked choice voting. I'd make it longer if I had the foggiest idea what it was. A little bit about Biden's first foreign trip, and I think quite appropriately in the news, Joe Manchin. Does it make sense? Inflation measured today, right now, is at 5%. Now that actually strikes me as very high, and alarmingly so. You look at the past 5 years, where 2.3% was the highest, and this low inflation rate has been present both through Obama's presidency, then Trump's presidency. It's not something you can say, point to a radical policy change and say that's what caused it. 5%, I mean, that's a number I think we should all focus on for a minute. That's serious. Why? And I've gone to different sources to come up with this list, but I've opened it to conversation points. In the article that I sent out, these were among the choices mentioned. How many of you, by the way, had a chance to read the briefing book? Oh, that's fabulous. That's fabulous. I should, somebody else come up here and do this then. Very good. The simple fact is, with all the two things have combined mean that there's a lot of cash in consumers' wallets. First is they have no place to spend it during COVID. And second is the federal government injected a huge amount of money into the pocketbooks of most people. The idea that people are going on vacation or out to eat now is much more appealing than it might have been in normal times, but coming out of COVID and staying home doesn't make any sense at all. Everybody wants to go out, and when they go out, they spend, and when they spend, it gets reflected in inflation numbers. Supply chains haven't recovered from the COVID interruptions. That makes a lot of sense to me. When you think how integrated our global economy is today, what happens in villages and far-off countries or small towns and rural counties in this country that interrupt the supply chain, that matters more perhaps than it did 15 years ago. This next one, I don't know how important the Colonial Pipeline issue was, but clearly for a brief period, it had to have an impact, did have an impact on gas prices. I don't know about the rest of you, but I haven't noticed a significant decline in gas prices after that pipeline was connected. And it makes one wonder, what's that song, things that make you want to say, done?
There is
Just a second, we can get you on mic.
Okay.
And you're recorded for history.
There is another result of the Colonial Pipeline shutdown, and that is that the price of Bitcoin has dropped dramatically.
Yes.
And that is a triple that because the FBI, without disclosing their means, were able to recover about half of the ransom that was paid. Now, that's also coupled with the Chinese government has essentially declared war on Bitcoin. But there's some big negative pressures on Bitcoin that's really probably started it from the recovery of some of the ransom on the Colonial Pipeline.
That's fascinating, and it reminds me, I'd like to see at some point, and maybe you and some other people get together and talk to us about that. Among the things that's on the long list of issues I don't understand is Bitcoin and the whole idea of cryptocurrencies. One of the things I thought was true was it's impossible to recover ransom from Bitcoin. It just can't happen because no government has anything to do with it, Doug.
The blockchain is confidential, but at some point, someone who was done collecting ransomware has to convert it into dollars, and that's how they recover it.
That's a good point. It's a good point. But keep in mind, put a note down. We're going to do a Bitcoin conversation. And you add to that, how in the world did gold create value? Where did that happen, and why was it so sticky that we still think gold represents value? It's the same theory, I think. If you believe in it, it's true. And then finally, on possible reasons for the rapid escalation and inflation, is that low-wage workers, and we're talking at the bottom of the minimum wage scale, are beginning to get raises. And part of that has to do with another topic that I think is fascinating, the shortage of workers. Put a note down somewhere. I believe a significant cause for that. Most people, at least some of the news sources, say there's a shortage of workers because they're getting so much money from the government they don't need to work. Yeah, and I think that's true for some lazy louts that I'd rather not know. And I wouldn't hire the son of guns anyway. That's just me. I think another significant factor, and it's one that we could do some serious digging on, is closing down immigration. A large part of that is COVID, granted, but another part of it is politics. Clearly, immigrants make up a significant part of the lower wage part of our economy. And when they are not there, those jobs are desperately hard to fill. And you talk to any carpenter about that, any construction company about that, and they'll say, we can't find tradesmen. because that used to be the ranks that were swelled by immigrants. Close down immigration, I guarantee you there'll be a serious labor shortage here. Talk about that another time. I don't think that has anything or much to do with inflation. Now, in that article I sent out, they said there are reasons to be worried about this higher inflation and then reasons not to be. Some of the reasons to worry. Some of the inflation pressure, that injection of money from the federal government into the system, is not going to abate anytime soon. The $300 nominally ends in September. Many states, by the way, ended it already. But for those states that haven't ended it, there'll probably be some pressure exerted on the government to continue it, particularly if there is a strong lobby saying people at the low end of the income scale still can't eat. A possibility. Some of those disruptions in the supply chain may have as much to do with the desire to reshape global economy over the last 4 years, to say that our reliance upon foreign supply chains creates a great weakness. Some of that pressure had to have an impact. And when you disrupt that international supply chain, for whatever reason, it's not like automatically the replacement supply chain in Kansas appears. It's going to take some time. And I think that's a reason to worry. I think the interruption may last longer than we think. Does that make sense? The long-term structural trends are less deflationary than one might think. As part of what we'll talk about is the reasons not to worry is long-term. We've not had inflation for a long time. That deflationary trends are powerful. Then consumers are loaded. I don't know why that's a reason to worry. I would think it'll just almost the opposite. If they're loaded, they'll spend more. Well, if they're loaded, they'll spend more, we'll call it. Something we'll talk about a lot is just on the horizon. On the horizon is a $6 trillion package from the Democrats, right on top of the just recently agreed $1 trillion, or right at it, the bipartisan proposal. We can talk a bit about that. In my mind, there's no question the pending impact of $7 trillion of the spending has to be inflationary, just full stop. Is it going to happen? In the last 24 hours, I think Biden has declared to some extent victory. We've got a deal, I think was the word. 5 senators and 5 congressmen. Charlie, you want to add to that? I don't know about that deal. Please.
Okay, I remember 15% inflation.
Yeah.
It's 5% now. I don't know. I thought it was less. Maybe that's where it's going.
That's just today.
Yeah, but that's not going to keep me from having a sleep at night.
It's making me sad.
That's the normal pendulum that we see. On the other thing that you mentioned, the deal reached. I guess it was this column in the Wall Street Journal calling it bait and switch. Biden says, yeah, we're going to get through with this first deal that we have on the infrastructure, but I'm not signing it unless we get the other deal done. What the hell is that all about?
Bait and switch. But I was going to say the same thing. It's one thing to have an agreement on the first $1 trillion, of which only about half is new money. And I think that would be an enormous achievement if it would hold. And I think even without the $6 trillion on the horizon, that's a tough solution. I mean, it's a tough effort. We're going to have to work hard to get it all the way through the completion line. But to immediately say we won't even support it if we don't get the $6 trillion, I think feels. I just think there are too many people that are going to say, how could they not? That's a lot of money. And is it inflationary? It's a lot of money. And I happen to be a believer that some of the things in that $6 trillion package are good things. People can disagree. I think, though, that if it's so, that some are good things, it would make it a lot easier to approve if you break it into some component parts. The $6 trillion is just too much money. I can't get my head around it. Reasons not to worry. A supermajority equals inflation derived from spikes in industries hammered by the pandemic. That makes sense. Part of what happened is truly relevant to the inflation, COVID's effect. Wage pressures, and some would say, unfortunately, are likely to ease come the fall. And they will certainly ease if we open the borders to more immigrant labor. That'll take some of the pressure off at the low-income level. Some sectors are already overcorrecting. And we talked about it last night. That's certainly not true in groceries for those of you who shop. It's not true in houses for those of you whose children are buying houses in Florida, or any of you fortunate enough to be selling a house in Florida. Banks are not doing what they normally do with the prospect of inflation. And piggybacking on what Charlie said, all of us here remember the 79-80 period when inflation was right close to 20%. 5%, for a long time, that was a goal, so why are we worried about 5%? This chart just shows a measure of inflation, the Fed funds rate over time. I found it interesting. You see in the middle of the 1979-80 period, that was the highest spike of inflation in a very long time. And that was a tough period. I think a lot of us, including, by the way, Congress and the electorate and the 2000 election, a lot of us were really frightened, and I think justifiably so, with that inflation level. I mean, just remember those wonderful days. And it's gone down. Our little present spike, and this goes back again supporting what Charlie said, a 5% rate today is still way below where it's been on average over the last 15 years, 20 years. Again, keep it in balance. But it's a topic. Any comments on inflation, what it's going to do to our lives? Is it going to affect Vickers? Are we going to see price increases? We were warned, at least we were, we moved in of a 4%, 4.5% increase. Is that going to be low? Any thoughts? They're probably going to be on the payroll by next week. Charlie already is.
You went through essentially the pros and cons there, and I guess it's what's the bridge between the two? And that would be that with this money in circulation, it's the psychological decision to spend. And you had a couple in your briefing materials. You had a couple of the ways that those expectations are measured. One is you have the market rate, and basically what you did is you take the rate on treasuries of a certain maturity, and then subtract the inflation bonds and get what the market's saying. That has probably not been the best indicator of what future inflation is going to be. Those indices right now probably indicate that over the next 5 years, inflation will be about 2.25%, which is not going to. That's probably Jerry Powell's issue there.
Yeah.
The other set of figures you had, you chose the one for the Cleveland Federal Reserve, which were essentially expectations, not market calculations, but expectations. That is probably the better indication of what the inflation rate is likely to be. Historically, the next expectation rate is 4%, is essentially when all hell breaks loose.
What is it now?
Well, your chart said about 3%. You used Cleveland, the Fed, and I think 3% is probably. I think the University of Michigan does a study. That's into the 3% range in these various surveys. But I think those are the better barometer of what's likely to happen. If that hits 4%, that gives you a trigger point where it starts getting the higher wages. You're talking about wages here. You look at the lower end. I mean, we all voted, in November to raise the,
Minimum wage.
raise the wages here in Florida. So I don't think the minimum wage, at the levels that was approved is gonna be, determinate. On the other hand, on the higher levels, when companies are willing to pay somebody X dollars, that's because they're looking to hire somebody that's gonna produce X plus Y dollars. So those are individual decisions that companies make. But when you have the labor unions, let's say, that are trying to push their wages above market, that's usually around the 4% mark for
Yeah,
that.
interesting that wasn't on the list that they had of pressures on inflation. I would have thought it would be. I guess it's partly because the union represents in the private sector about 4% of our workers is way down from where it used to be. And I guess public sector workers would be bringing up to 12, 13%. And that's clearly could be wage pressure. One thing you said intrigued me. In my limited economics understanding, it's mostly a sort of Keynesian approach here. When inflation goes up, we take money out of the system. When the country starts to slow down, we try to inject money into the system. The whole concept of the government being the consumer of second resort. When the consumer stops spending, the government starts spending in order to keep consumption at a level that makes the economy grow. And let's say for a moment that rate that you were talking about, the one that matters the most, reaches 4%. Is our government prepared to roll back this infrastructure spending? Because it's the reverse of what should happen with pending inflation. Do you understand my question?
Volcker did 40 years ago.
Is Powell in that school?
Powell does not appear to be in that school right now. Now, another, I guess, negative aspect for inflation. Right now, the government is borrowing all these trillions of dollars. We have inflation, let's say, at least we have to agree is running, let's say, at a 2.5% plus rate. But at the 10-year treasury is only using, let's say, at 1.5%. That means that same old right now, the national debt is going down as a percentage of the economy, even though no principal payments are being made against it.
Just because the
inflation here, because it's a one way to reduce the federal debt.
Interesting. I love it, actually. Other comments? I'll be curious to know over the next few months, particularly for people who are in the spending category, who go to the grocery store or whose children report what's happening in their lives, what impact it seems the changes as we go forward has on apparent inflation. I think that grocery store indicator, which is probably not enumerated as well as it should be in all these data points, that's a pretty interesting thing. What was it, Sally Ann, you said a jar of
Peanut butter.
peanut butter? Was it, no, somebody said peanut butter is the best index in the world. It's worth
A jar of peanut butter at Publix was $9.50 or whatever, and I stood there and I said, gosh, I can remember when $10 was a really beautiful gift from my parents or whoever, and I'm looking at a jar of peanut butter for almost this amount of money. Now, obviously, I think you can get it for a little less at Trader Joe's, but when I start shopping around for peanut butter, it gets a little scary.
Okay. I'm sorry, Bob.
I'm a farmer, so I'm going to tell you about what happened on the farm. I'm from the farm, so I'm going to tell you what happened during 79 and 80. And that is, it was an absolute revolution on our farms. We lost so many farmers who just absolutely lost everything. On a farm, you could keep your house, period. You couldn't keep the garages, you couldn't keep the barns, you couldn't keep the land. And that happened all over the United States. And I was at a situation where I go out and talk to the farmers, various and sundry subjects. There was only one subject back then, And it was, what are we going to do about all of these losses of farms and all the things that were going on? It was a revolution, and what happened to the ownership of farms was it was bought up by wealthy people, and people talked about doctors and lawyers and so on. But anyone who had some money and could buy under those circumstances. But the farmers, literally, many of them, I know some who went to the poor farmers because of the loss. And they had farmed all of their life. In fact, the matter is, many of them had been in the family for generations. And it was, what was the name of that guy that was the crook with the Madoff, that made all those bad deals for the people and wiped out people. I know in Palm Beach that this is a different era. Same kind of thing. That people who we noticed. We went to the Palm Beach Opera, and almost the entire board, who usually are very wealthy people, resigned. They couldn't afford to do that. And some of them had to go into rental properties. So that's what happened in Palm Beach. Much later, that's not a farm issue, but
I love the sequence. Let's go to that. Okay. Now,
I think it reminds me of Schitt's Creek. If any of you have ever watched Schitt's Creek, it's exactly what happened. These wealthy people ended up having to go to a town that they had bought just for fun out in, where was it, Idaho, I think.
No, I didn't love the show.
Oh my gosh, it was unbelievable. I also remember the time that you're talking about, because I was in real estate and the interest rates were over 20%. And once you get over 13%, you cannot buy back your own home. You cannot afford it. And those were tough times. But we survived, didn't we?
this is amazing.
It's amazing.
So maybe one
We
thing
survived COVID.
one thing we can do, Bob, one thing we can do is go ahead and buy that jar of peanut butter to support the peanut farmers.
That's right.
Charlie?
Yeah, you mentioned before, I think you said something about how will that affect us, inflation. I say
Yeah,
us.
I'm talking about we need here Vickers.
Yeah, I'm talking about here at Vickers and places like that.
Yeah.
You mentioned before, the baby boomers now are in full bloom. They're looking to do what's next to their life. I think a lot of them are looking perhaps to this as their next step, like we did. And I'm curious about this influx, what effect it will have on the industry in terms of will they be building more places like this? What will be the cost of it? What will be the cost to get into it? How will that affect us? So we are already doing something with our growth a mile away. But I'm curious as to, is anybody in the industry looking ahead to say, this is what is going to be happening in the next 5 years?
Is Jenny here? Not Jenny, Sherry, Sears. Curious to know whether our board talks about that. I mean, Bruce isn't here today, often comes in. But I think that's a question we have to put to the board. But I still wonder, whatever happens, are we, since we're here now, to some extent immune from what happens, or over the next 25 years, for those of us who might be here in 25, will this global impact affect us? I don't know. So it'll be interesting to see. Let's move on, just because we have a half hour left and maybe some interesting topics. The setup I sent out was ranked choice voting. It happened Tuesday in New York. The first round is completed, but not quite. At the end of that round, as I showed here, Adams was in the lead, a solid sort of moderate, but Maya Wiley, who was very progressive, was second. Garcia, another moderate third. The next event is July 9th, when the absentee ballots come in and have to be tallied. Actually, the 9th is at the end of the cure period. There's a brief cure period on absentee ballots. As I understand it, people who marked Adams second, I don't understand it, I'm not going to say. Somehow they reshuffle each time they count, moving, cutting off the bottom and allocating those votes across the top. Does anybody from Boston know about the answer to that? Does anybody understand ranked choice voting? John?
As I understand it, Yang was eliminated. He was last in the series. His votes go to the number 2 candidate.
Even if they voted for Adams as their second choice?
Those that voted for Yang,
Right.
his votes are redistributed to the number 2 candidate.
All of them? What if you...
Understood what I was reading this morning.
What I look forward to, maybe we're not going to put this to bed now, because on the 9th, when the absentee ballots are distributed according to how they voted, then the next step is that first allocation. And I'll be curious, let's just put a footnote down or a marker. We'll come back to this subject when they reallocate. Because I thought Yang was fourth, not last, but I could be wrong there. He was last among the two. As I'm just looking at you, it reminds me, I think Garcia was neck and neck with Wiley.
He voted for himself, and his second choice was Garcia, then his vote would go to Garcia. It doesn't automatically go to Adams, if Adams wasn't one of his choices.
That's kind of my understanding. Let's wait 2 weeks and see how it's allocated, and we'll all be smart. Carol, you first.
What happens is somebody has to get 50% to win. So they keep going down to see what ranking people gave, what Sue was just explaining. That if they voted for somebody who's second and third, and if Yang is out, his vote is not counted anymore. And somebody has to get 50% to win. So
Right.
it might not be Adams.
That's what they say, is it enough to, but again, if John's right, then Adam has a greater chance than if some of those votes of Yang were allocated to Garcia and some to Wiley. I want to wait. Doug, you have...
Yes, without getting into all the specific issues like that, we're looking at 2 weeks from today before we know what happened last Tuesday. And I can't believe, when I look at elections that occurred, when I was much younger, you woke up the next morning knowing what the result was. Now, the alternative to this is where you have a runoff election. And you pick the top two. They're Adams and Wiley. You put them, they have card of ballot. You got 2 people to vote for. If you want to write in somebody else and lose your vote, you can. But
The ranked choice was designed, and then we'll come back to Ken. Ranked choice was designed to prevent this concept of plurality winners, which frankly happens in almost any race where there are more than 2 candidates and no one gets to 50%. Then it goes to the one who had the highest number of votes, who may not have a majority. And we've had that over and over again. Ken?
Well, this only applies to primary elections.
Yeah, it's not the general, the Republicans are selected in different ways.
General election does have one for president with regard to the electoral college and minimum number of votes that a candidate has to get. If there's more than 2 candidates and they don't get enough electoral votes.
I think I understand. Sue, and let's move on, because we're going to wait 2 weeks, that's what we're going to do. Sue?
This prevents runoffs, where you have a big expense because you have to hold another election.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you now.
This prevents runoffs, where you can hold another election, and that's very expensive. Now, the interesting one, I think Alaska has ranked choice voting irrespective of party. So
every situation between now and then. I want you all to notice that I'm not wearing mascara. Did you see Rudy Giuliani when you were asleep? Well, for some reason I'm perspiring today. Biden's first foreign trip. Every president has to take one. The news that I've read, and I circulated this to all of you, indicates that the general attitude, and this I think reflects more than anything else our polarized country, was pretty cool toward Biden's trip. It wasn't an outrageous success. It wasn't a complete failure. The data that 44% approval, 40% disapproval on his Putin meeting, on foreign policy generally, just about split even. And that's comparing Biden to some extent with Trump, whose foreign policy experience was certainly different from what Biden's is. And whether you're a pro-Biden or pro-Trump, you have to admit that experientially, Biden should be just really good. He has more experience than anyone since H.W. Bush in terms of the number of offices held, the number of countries visited, the number of heads of state that he knew. The meeting with Putin, we won't know, I don't think, on that for a while. Biden seemed more pleased than Putin to me, just watching the news. Clearly, NATO and G7 ties improved. Our posture vis-a-vis Europe and the G7 countries in the last 4 years has largely been, we don't need you, we don't want you. And just a footnote, then China came up everywhere, even in the meeting with Putin. China came up with G7, NATO, and Putin. The G7 meeting is important, and I don't know how many of you have followed the G7 over the years, essentially the wealthy countries getting together to talk about it. The countries and, as a member, the European Union. The issues that they talked about, the key issues, as reported from the meeting, clearly Russia, not just as a threat to democracy and Russians fiddling with elections. We complain about it here, but it's present throughout Europe. And I think it's even more aggressive in some of the European countries. But also this concept of a kind of out of control internet community. And I'm not sure the government in Russia has the ability to change that. I wouldn't know what we would do here. I mean, do you arrest anybody who's, I guess you would, try to do any kind of ransomware. And I guess we'll try to arrest them internationally. But that seems out of control. The Russian interference in elections, interference in commerce. That was an issue at G7 and China, vaccine distribution, presence, and availability of vaccines, period. With a request at the G7 for all the countries there to up their number of vaccines contributed to the available pool. The issue of global taxation, of course, what we're trying to do is say there is a floor on global taxation which will theoretically limit companies from moving abroad to a lower tax situation. If every country adopts at least, I think we said 15% was our floor, Charlie?
I just want to go back to one of your other slides of something you said. Why was Biden's disapproval rating as high as it was?
My sense is, and this is my answer, and I'm open for anybody else to answer, in a polarized situation, 50% of the Senate is blue and 50% is red. And the Senate is not Democratic, it's not majoritarian. So the number of senators from small states is the same as big states. So as a percentage of the population, it doesn't represent it. But we were perilously close, have been forever, on presidential elections to 51, 49, 50, 50. Some people will, well, the total population difference was 7.5 million for Biden. But if you do the electoral college, it's 45,000 votes. One way or the other way to swung those states over. So we're really a divided nation, rather evenly so. So I'm not at all surprised that it's 44, 43. If it were higher in approval, I think there would be a commensurate increase in disapproval. Does that make sense to you? Anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, yes, it does make sense in terms of the mathematics. I was just wondering, you're making a comparison between Biden and Trump, if I can mention his name. And one of the things I think is that Trump had a very definite idea what his policies would be. He let everybody know it. There was no question about what he wanted and the direction he wanted to take the country. Biden, on the other hand, is going in, from what I've read, with a concept of reconciliation.
Yeah.
Let's all be friends. Let's make nice. But I'm really a little short on his policies.
But isn't making nice in and of itself a policy?
Pardon me?
Isn't making nice in and of itself a policy?
One could say that, yeah, but maybe people view that as, some people view that as being weak.
Certainly those who don't want to make nice, but does that make sense to me? If your attitude is a Trump attitude for policy, we don't need you, we don't want you, and we're therefore not going to let you have much to do with what we do here at home, that attitude is a policy. But the other, which is to say we're an integrated global population and global economy, and we all need each other. Let's make nice, even with our enemies. To me, and I'm saying 50% of this country, smart people, believe one side. This is, I think, 50% believe the other. Doug?
Yes, while Biden was overseas, he is my president, as president of the United States. One thing I liked here is that there seemed to be more one-on-one private conversations and less photo ops and so forth. So I like that aspect of it. We're not going to know whether it was good or bad or whatever for probably quite a while, but I like the fact that there were a lot of private meetings, and I wish Biden the best when he's representing me and the rest of the country.
Good for you. Very good. Sue?
Unfortunately, Biden's policy, both national and foreign, doesn't depend on him, it depends on Mitch McConnell and the filibuster. So, I mean, with this polarization, it's not going anywhere.
We're going to get to that when we talk about Joe Manchin, as you can well imagine. Caroline?
I think you failed to take into consideration how all the other people in the rest of the world feel about this conference and Biden's first trip. It makes a huge difference in Europe and in all the other countries involved with the G7. And they are so in favor because they know now what policies are, and they know that NATO and G7 have been strengthened. And that makes a huge difference in the rest of the world.
Caroline, we have, as you done its typical surveys of foreign attitudes, is that data out now on this recent trip? I didn't see it. Normally we do see polling in foreign countries, and the Pew Center is among others one that does it. I haven't seen that data, but you're right. My guess is, I haven't seen it, so I'll just say what I think it is. Makes stuff up. But my guess is that it's very favorable. Should we go down just a little bit further? Because I want to talk, particularly after what Sue says, a little bit about Van Manchin before we leave, a lot about it. The NATO issues, I'm not going to bore you with much. This was all from the information that I distributed. NATO, unlike the G7, G7 is all powerful, wealthy countries and the European Union. NATO kind of wants anybody willing to fight Russia. And one of the questions that needs to be sorted out, and I'm sure the NATO authorities are doing so, is how relevant are we today when the likelihood of a war, a ground war particularly by the Russians against Europe, is so low? What's the purpose of NATO as a military alliance other than kind of to put a stick in the eye of the Russians? And that needs to be sorted out. But you'll see members like the Eastern European countries, many of which are small in population, small in economy, still members of NATO. Should we go to Joe Manchin? Because we have 15 minutes left, and it speaks really directly to he is right in the middle of this question of what will happen due to the filibuster and the 50-50 majority. I have heard more than one person in this room say, why in the world isn't Joe Manchin a Republican? He's conservative. He's in a state that was 2-1 for Trump. It's just stupid for him not to be a Republican. And he's not doing Democrats any good. To which I say, how do you like the Speaker, the leader of the Senate, McConnell? How do you like the fact that not a single Democratic bill will make it through to a vote if the leadership of the Senate changes? And the only reason Schumer is leader of the Senate is Joe Manchin. You could say Ann Sinema, but those are the two swings. And all the talk about, my goodness, why doesn't he just switch to the party that's more logical? It seems to me ignores that fundamental part. He's hugely valuable to the Democrats if he votes against them, because he is designated as a Democrat. Just some data on his background. And I have to admit, I spent a lot of time, 10 years in West Virginia in the coal business. I didn't know that Manchin was a coal sales broker before he was elected to the Senate. During his long period in the West Virginia House and Senate, during that whole time, he ran this company, EnerSystems, which I knew about. I just didn't know Manchin was part of it. He's truly a West Virginia boy, West Virginia High School, West Virginia University, then coal broker. Because of that company, his net worth is about $6 million. As I understand it from my brief reading of the biographies of the people here, that would mean he's in the low echelon of Vickers residents. But among senators, oddly enough, $6 million is pretty high. I think there are about 12 senators ahead of him. I think there's some House members that have more wealth, but in the Senate, 112 million, I think, was the top, and I forget the name of the guy who had it. But Manchin's up in the top 10. And that all came from that coal brokerage that he had, not from graft as a politician. He lost his first effort to be governor, ran again and won in 2004. And the attitude in West Virginia is generally very positive about his period as governor and his ability to win election after election as a senator in a very red state must evidence that. But the idea is 2-1 Trump support in his state means he can't very, very far into progressive territory, or wander very far into that territory, or he's bound to lose. What that means, though, is that everything that might be done in a 50-50 Senate has to have his vote. Especially, I'll talk about the filibuster, which Sue brought up. I've already said here that while I was ambivalent before and kind of agreed with Biden and others that the filibuster is a cherished, important part of our Senate tradition and therefore must be maintained, I now think it's purely bogus, racist relic and should be thrown into the dustbins of history. And other than that, I'm fairly neutral. But the fact of the matter is, without modifying the filibuster, you can kiss all that infrastructure goodbye, forget about voting rights legislation, forget about a whole host of legislative initiatives the Democrats have advanced. Even Democrats in the Senate, less progressive than the House, it stops dead with the filibuster. So what do we do about that?
Why do away with it? Why do away with it?
Because of that. Because what it means is we don't have majority rule. And for those of you Let me just say, Bob, and I completely agree. If the Republicans were in charge, and the only way we could stop them was to use the filibuster, I'd be so adamantly opposed to changing the filibuster and embarrass you. But now that we're in charge, I really honestly believe in democracy. I'm not at all interested in interfering with anyone's right to vote, making it hard in any way. I think we should make it so easy to vote that we get close to 80 or 85% voting, period. I really believe that. But I also believe if you're going to get to a majority of people voting, their majority vote should count. And it doesn't if you have relics like the filibuster.
And you'd like to get rid of the electoral college also.
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
Ask me about state lines.
We wouldn't have 50 states.
We wouldn't have 50 states. I don't think we need 50 states. We can have 50 regions just because we've got the Senate carved out with 50 seats. But those regions each have equal population.
With the electoral college, give it some thought. The big cities will run this country. That leaves everybody else out.
Those other two people. That's my point. And it's not two people. Everybody else outside of the cities represents about 15% of the population. Are we going to say because the big cities have more, call it Democrats, or more poor people, or more black people, we're just not going to let them win? Ken?
Listen, I didn't prepare anything on this subject, but Joe Manchin to me gets a profile in courage. You know, Biden ran really on bipartisanship. That's what he ran on, what he promised. So what's happening with the infrastructure bill as an example is bipartisanship, and Manchin's been active in it. But now, we're going to go with this second vote on this other package, this $6 trillion. I mean, the point is that every 2 years there's elections for Senate, not for President. And if 50-50, it's the way the people want it. And until this changes, until one party convinces the other, people rather, we're going to have this kind of a 50-50 split. Let either the Republicans or the Democrats win bigger in the next there's still some Senate races in 2022. So let's do it that way. You don't want all the bills coming through the Senate all the time, every 2 years. It requires some really courage of the way they vote on things. It's not party line all the time. It can't be. And I had some other points, but I can't think of them right now.
But I agree with those other points.
Well, and if we had an hour, we could talk about the Electoral College, which I disagree with you on.
And by the way, I totally respect your view on the Senate Electoral College. I'll come back to that. Doug?
Our constitutional system was never set up for majority rule. The whole Bill of Rights is a listing of amendments to protect minority rights. So there are a number of rights in this country that are delineated in the Constitution that are not subject to minority rule. So this idea of total minority rule is not the system that we have inherited in the United States.
There's no question about that, and that's why I react so strongly personally in discussions about returning to that merely sacred document, the Constitution. It was so profoundly opposed to minority rights that black people were 3/4 or 3/5 of a human being. There's nothing democratic about that document.
That was then.
We're talking about the Founding Fathers. What changed 30 years later, changed 30 years later. But the Founding Fathers created a government based on protecting the small states and allowing slavery. That's what it was all about. And so many of the discussions, if you read the Federalist Papers and read them carefully, so many of those discussions were just that. How much power do we give the small states versus the big states? What are we in the world going to do about the fact that half this country is slavery? And that compromise reached, to me, isn't sacred. To me, it's one that we should be able to talk about. And by the way, I think talking about the filibuster, by that I mean openly, being willing to discuss it is important, just as it is important to be open to discussing the electoral college. And it's okay for anyone to be on a different side of the being. I respect that completely.
Yeah, there's no reason why it has to be necessarily 60 votes. It could be less. That is not in the Constitution. But it does require more discussion. But if you eliminate I mean, we make it sound like only the Republicans use the filibuster. Come on.
The filibuster is used more by the Democratic racist party for years than anybody
It
else.
works back and forth, and you have to keep that balance in there.
Yeah. I recommend for any of you who have a chance to read a book called Kill Switch. And Kill Switch, I forget the author's name now, but it's a book about the history and use of the filibuster. There's no question that filibuster is a Democratic Party creation. It was made powerful by Richard Russell, a Democrat, and without his role and basically the strong power of the racist Southern bloc of Democrats, who basically said we're not going to allow any civil rights legislation. That was the sole purpose of the filibuster until 2008. And it was used infrequently during the period 65 to 2008. But now all of a sudden it's become this, and it's become this partisan tool, used just as much by the Democrats, I completely agree with you, as by the Republicans. It's become that in our now 50-50 Senate. If the 50-50 represented the population, I'd say go for it. If we don't get 51% of the votes, we don't prevail in the Senate. But if in fact you can get 25% of the vote and get 51 senators, that's what makes me uncomfortable. And again, it is a big city versus a small town. Excellent. We have a question from the next generation.
Very good.
I think with the filibuster, there's discussion about reforming it, and I think that makes a lot more sense. So today, you need 60 votes for cloture. The discussion is 41 votes for filibuster. And that...
To switch it from negative to positive.
Correct. So if you want a filibuster, you have to be on the record saying, I want a filibuster, and no reading green eggs in hand. It should be a debate on the bill on the floor, and to make the bill better. So there's no reason, if you want bipartisanship, I think you have to have that debate, not shut off a debate entirely, which is the way it is now. And then you're eliminating the opportunity to really have a bill that maybe no one's going to get 100% of what they want, but at least you get a bill that isn't going to be overturned in the next election. I mean, that's...
Sign her up.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Did somebody raise their hand about that? Charlie, did you understand the concept of the 41 to filibuster as opposed to 60 to end filibuster? It's a big difference.
I think I do. I think one of the issues here, I think, is why are we all different? What is it all about? And I think what we're seeing here going on right now, this is the normal. This is what happens generation after generation. It's the normal concept of thing. We think it's important for this to happen, not to happen. That's normal. What's in back of it all? Power. Who's got the power to get things done in their own interest? And this shifts. But it is the one thing that it all winds up with is the power to get things done in the way that you want them to.
Yeah. Sue?
I think the biggest problem right now is you've got a whole bunch of senators that are not voting their conscience or for their constituents' views, they're voting their fears.
Did everybody hear that? I think that's in the large part true, but one of the things I believe about polarization is that increasingly those senators on both sides who vote however they vote are voting that way because of a deeply held viewpoint. They're not just fake progressives or fake radical conservatives. who are voting because they're voting on because that's the only way to be elected. They believe that. Left and right. They just pull toward the edges. I don't think it's a good thing. I mean, I wish there were more who were more toward the middle and who said, I have to vote this way, not because I think it's right or wrong, but because my constituent wants it. I think it's wrong, whatever it is, or I think it's right. Do you understand what I'm saying there? It's not positive that there's that polarization. Don?
I leave it with two thoughts. One, an item that I read just recently that said democracy requires the consent of the losers. We're not getting it, are we?
I like that.
And the second,
I like
I raised the question for everybody to think about. Is the experiment that mankind has been having over the last few hundred years, or about 200 years, with democracy, is it working? I suggest that maybe it's not.
Deep thoughts at the last minute of our office. Actually, I want to thank, I'm sorry I forgot your name. Carolyn, for her comment on the filibuster. I wish that there was a succinct description of the proposals. I've read that, but I can't say it as clearly as you did. That's really a powerful change, along with some of the other suggestions. But that alone leaves the 60-40 thing the same. You just flip. You have to stop it at 40 or start it with 40 or stop it with 60.
And have an actual debate.
And have a real debate. Actual debate, not just tell people what you're, in the back room. And Don, your comments are deep and profound and sad. But democracy is not winning very many races successfully today. Well, listen, it'll be 2 weeks before we meet again, and at the moment, I think that critical race theory is on the list. I wouldn't mind, we'll know more by then. 2 weeks from now, we'll know how much stuff was just killed dead over in this whole Biden package. I think the infrastructure will either be a possibility or dead. Both of the billion, or the trillion and the 6 trillion. We'll know something more about the New York primary. I think that what happens with the Manchin cinema discussion, and sadly, I don't think there's going to be any move on the filibuster. It'd be great if they come up with modification rather than elimination. And that might be the compromise that Manchin can achieve. And if he does so, wow. Thank you all, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Very good.